You've got a lust for life, or at least for space combat, in this 50th episode of NES Works Gaiden. Next up for Famicom, we have Namco's first release to have been designed specifically for that platform. But while Star Luster may not be the usual sort of arcade conversion that Namcot has dealt in to this point, it should feel very, very familiar to certain elder nerds.
Star Luster belongs to a long and healthy lineage of games stretching all the way back into the early 1970s. I touched briefly on this history during the Star Voyager episode of NES Works and again in the Elite retrospective. With Star Luster, Namco broke that ground for the Nintendo platform. Although it doesn't draw on an existing Namco arcade creation, Star Luster does succeed on the strength of the company's intuitive grasp of what makes a cool action game and its practiced ability to distill complex game mechanics into something suited for a console or a coin-op milieu. Star Luster hails from the same pool of inspiration as the Tower of Jiraga, which stripped the PC role-playing genre down to its bare essence so that it could be played with a joystick and a single action button. Star Luster does something similar, only with the space simulator genre. Star Luster does not rely on the same unfriendly hidden elements as Jiraga. This was not designed as a social arcade experience to be embraced indirectly among multiple tip-sharing Game Center fans. It's a solo play creation designed for the home, the coin-op versus Star Luster being an afterthought. And as such, it creates depth and extends playtime through the complexity of the sandbox that lurks beneath a seemingly simple interface. There is one existing arcade link here, though. I haven't been able to dig up any firm information on the genesis of Star Luster, but it connects to Namco's arcade legacy in such a way that I can't help but wonder if it might have begun life as an attempt at a coin-op conversion. Star Luster sees players traveling across the galaxy, defending star bases from alien attackers in free space. The star bases bear an unmistakable resemblance to the hexagonal alien bases that serve as your primary targets in Bosconian, a top-down, free-scrolling space shooter. Bosconian stands out as one of the few Namco arcade creations of the post-Pac-Man golden era never to make its way to Famicom or NES. It shares that trait with Rally X, which I've mentioned before. And like Rally X, Bosconian revolved around high-speed action in free, multi-directional scrolling arenas, a feature that the NES hardware didn't natively support. Although we've seen several games at this point that seemingly defy that technical prohibition, they've all moved at a far slower pace than Bosconian. Think Onyanko Town, a game that appeared to be falling apart at the seams, even moving at its decidedly measured pace. Or Devil World, which crept along at a snail's pace and largely allowed the CPU to determine the direction of scrolling. The closest analog to Bosconian to appear on Famicom to this point was Raid on Bungling Bay. That particular PC conversion came from Hudson, who had an inside line on the Famicom hardware thanks to their early relationship with Nintendo. And even then, that played pretty rough and loose. I could easily imagine Star Luster emerging from an experiment to bring Bosconian to Famicom that abandoned the idea of top-down free-scrolling in favor of a first-person perspective. This would have offered the dual advantage of being a lot easier to simulate on Famicom hardware than a full-scrolling top-down map, while also having ample precedent to draw upon. After all, it had been barely more than a year since Braben and Bell delivered unto the British microcomputer community their impossible masterpiece Elite, a pan-galactic combat and trading simulation that created an entire universe with a measly few dozen kilobytes of code. Elite in turn drew heavily upon Atari's Star Raiders, a first-person space shooter that blew minds when it debuted on the company's 8-bit computers in 1980. Star Raiders in turn had precedents such as Mike Mayfield's text-based Star Trek, an unofficial and unlicensed game that made the rounds on mini-computers beginning in 1971 before eventually showing up on home computers once those actually, existed. This unofficial Star Trek informed Sega's licensed 1982 Star Trek coin-op vector game, which seems likely to have provided some inspiration for Atari's Star Wars from 1983. The kind of people who were programming Famicom games in 1985 were also the same sort of people who had their finger on the pulse of Western arcade and computer games that trickled their way into Japan. In one English-language interview with Star Luster designer Shigeki Toyama, courtesy of Shmublations naturally, Toyama cited several Western film influences on his ship designs in Xevious. This includes the grounded mechanical aesthetics of Ron Cobb's set and miniature works in Alien, as well as Star Wars Battlestar Galactica and British series UFO. In other words, Toyama seems like one of those Japanese creatives who loved Western media, the equivalent of American nerds who were extremely into unlocalized anime like Gundam around the same time. And it seems totally inconceivable that he would somehow not have been aware of at least Star Raiders. So why not turn Bosconian into a Star Raiders and Elite clone on hardware that couldn't handle the actual Bosconian? Or perhaps Toyama's thought process worked the other way. Why not toss some of Makoto Sato's Bosconian base designs into a Star Raiders clone, since both games involved freewheeling through space? Either way, the end result works out to a reversal of Bosconian's premise, in which you defend the hexagonal space structures instead of destroying them. Your fighter ship operates based on a single source of energy that powers all of its functions: local flight, warp, shields, offensive weapons, and more. During the course of the game, a star map reveals the layout of local space, the location of bases, your ship's current whereabouts, and the position of incoming hostiles. You need to leap across space to intercept enemies in dogfights before they can take down your bases. Running out of energy in the heartless void of extrasolar space results in an instant game over, whether you die in blazing combat with an advanced mothership that can take down your shields in a single shot, or simply peter out due to poor travel planning. Space doesn't care how it kills you, it just kills you. As a reward for keeping starbases from being reduced to molten fragments of metal and rapidly outgassing their life support, you get to stop by every now and then to top off your tanks. Since Star Luster uses bitmap graphics on a default in-ROM chip rather than vector art on an advanced mapper, you don't get that neat trademark elite spinning effect as you line up your docking port with the base's rotation, but the mechanic works the same regardless. Star Luster encompasses very nearly the full gamut of the space sim genre through its difficulty settings. Although it lacks the trade elements that drove Elite, it otherwise allows you to approach the game as a simple arcade-style shooter or as a more involved strategic defense game. You access the former option by setting the game to practice difficulty, which drops you into a fairly straightforward mission to defend a single location against a handful of invaders. At the other extreme, the highest difficulty clutters space with bases and enemies, adding advanced invader variants to the mix, and generally demanding efficient play, strategic planning, and vigilant response. Although Star Luster lacks the staying power of a proper sim like Elite, you still can't help but be impressed by what Namco managed to accomplish here. Squeezing a Star Raiders-style game onto this console in its early days must have been no small feat, but it works. Now, Wikipedia claims that Star Luster was widely disliked at the time of its release, as it proved too complex for the Famicom audience to comprehend. This may be true, but in hindsight, the game seems to have built a respectable legacy for itself. Several developers have cited it as an influence, and more Famicom space sims would arrive in its wake, including ASCII's Star Voyager, and Star Luster itself saw a handful of sequels, such as 1999's Star Ixiom for PlayStation. As I mentioned last episode, the Famicom had entered a phase of bold experimentation in late 1985, and while not every one of those efforts panned out, looking at you here, Challenger, sometimes you ended up with a nice little project like Star Luster.
And finally, the Famicom's Western Blitz culminates in another conversion of a microcomputer classic that would go on to become a beloved standby of Kusoge fans. Yes, that's right, it's Irem's port of Spelunker.
Irem, another of the Japanese corporations that Broderbund allied itself with in the early 1980s, came into that collaboration in a totally organic fashion. After getting its start with some largely forgotten Invaders clones and whatnot, Irem achieved its first major hit with 1982's Moon Patrol. A side-view auto-scrolling shooter, Moon Patrol stands out for, 1, being one of the earliest games to incorporate scrolling, and 2, not being a traditional shooter. It essentially inverted the concept of Konami's hits Scramble and Super Cobra, in that rather than controlling an airborne combat vehicle that could fire forward and bomb the ground, you instead controlled a ground-based vehicle. Your moon buggy could fire forward and up into the air, giving enemies the advantage of the high ground and largely removing the passive nature of oil tanks and ground emplacements that you struck on the vertical axis in Scramble. In addition to that elevated threat element, Moon Patrol also forced you to deal with the terrain, as your buggy would explode if you smashed into a lunar crater rather than leaping it. A tough, inventive, and visually striking game, Moon Patrol soon found itself given an American release by Williams, and money presumably began flooding into the Irem coffers. In any case, Irem fixed its sights on the overseas market from that point, producing a number of arcade titles that either catered to the US market or else used America as a setting or source of coin-op creations that had a unique flavor within the early 80s Japanese market. Motor Race USA, better known on home consoles as Zippy Race, tasked players with driving across North America's highways, stopping along the way at major cities. 10-Yard Fight turned American football into a streamlined offensive advancement challenge. And then in 1984, Irem, according to former coin-op division head Scott Tsumura, was the first company to bring Broderbund's Loadrunner to Japan by way of arcades. Loadrunner would of course become a huge breakout hit on Famicom a few months later, and could be seen as the moment at which Nintendo's console broke ahead of the pack. Tsumura feels that Hudson's cartridge did as well as it did because audiences had already been introduced to Loadrunner through Irem's conversion. And his claim has merit. The arcade-to-console pipeline counted for a lot in the early 1980s, and a rapid, well-executed turnaround from game center to living room gave players the sensation that they were experiencing the cutting edge of tech and design. Of course, Loadrunner wasn't so much a rapid turnaround as it was simply multiple companies drawing from the same source simultaneously. But it's not as though the average home consumer in 1984 Japan knew that, or cared to wade into the particulars of international video game licensing. They just knew that this Famicom system had that cool maze-running chase and drill game that seemed to combine elements of Space Panic, Heian-kyo Alien, and Donkey Kong Jr. all at once. Granted, Loadrunner showed up for a huge number of other platforms around the same time, everything from home computers to SG-1000. Yet only the Famicom version became a million seller and set its host platform on the road to becoming a global powerhouse. That, I think, is where you see the merit in Tsumura's assertion for the significance of the Irem adaptation. Unlike most other ports of Loadrunner to Japanese systems, Irem and Hudson's stood out for their creators' willingness to take the time to overhaul the visuals of the game. Rather than sticking with the original Apple II stickmen and monochromatic mazes, both Irem and Hudson redrew their games to have a more cartoonish style that better fit the developing manga-inspired aesthetic that were coming to define Japanese hits. Anyway, the point is, Irem saw remarkable success with Loadrunner's arcade conversion, quickly following it up with multiple coin-op sequels and landing rights for the Famicom Disk System platform. So you can imagine that the company may have been looking to coax lightning to strike a second time when it licensed Micrographic Image's computer platform action hit Spelunker for Japanese arcades and the Famicom. Challenging action game, lots of climbing and jumping and avoiding traps, it seemed a sure thing. And as it happened, Irem wagered smartly. Spelunker didn't become a hit for Irem on the scale of Loadrunner, but not a lot of games did. It nevertheless found a sizable audience, enough to merit a claim on its 1987 American box art that it had sold more than 500,000 units in Japan, and for that matter to inspire Broderbund to pick it up for American distribution as part of their brief arrangement to help support Irem as it brought its Famicom releases to NES. Even now, Spelunker has a certain cachet among old-timers in Japan. Irem revived the franchise during the PlayStation 3 era, not only with HD remakes and other spin-offs that would be released under the eye of ex-Irem staff at Tozai, but also with merchandise. Spelunker has a reputation as a troll game in which even the most seemingly meaningless action or object can result in sudden, unexpected death. Trip over a mound of dirt? Dead. Bat poop on your head? Dead. Walk into a spray of water? Dead. Drop to the ground from the height of a few feet? Extremely dead. Spelunker is funny because the game gives you a gun, yet you still feel almost helpless, and not in a survival horror kind of way. Rather, just about the only thing you can kill with that gun, counterintuitively enough, is a ghost that materializes to chase you around from time to time. Otherwise, the gun does very little to protect you against the innumerable hazards that fill Spelunker's subterranean world. It's a game where your worst enemy is you. Once you get a handle on which things will kill you, basically everything, and how not to die, basically be extremely careful at all times, Spelunker becomes manageable. You can never let your guard down entirely or play casually, which poses a real challenge for anyone whose platform action brain had been rewired by Super Mario Bros. To expect running and jumping to be a fun, liberating, freeform action. But no, not in Spelunker. You are not Mario. You are a little guy who does not, to my knowledge, have a name, and cannot run and jump and squish bad guys on a whim. You need to carefully navigate ladders, elevators, pits, lakes, and other bits of underground scenery in order to open the way forward to the lowest levels of the caves and steal a treasure that someone placed there to very deliberately keep it out of the hands of someone like you thieving monster. The NES game simplifies the cave structure somewhat from the PC original, thanks for that developer Tose, but doesn't abandon the founding premise of Spelunker, which is that everything will kill you. Like a lot of games from this era, Spelunker doesn't go easy on you, and you can burn through your lives pretty quickly. But at the same time, it feels just manageable enough that you can master it without needing to rely on luck, making your way a little further into the caverns each time you play. Spelunker is the kind of game where you can only laugh at the audacity of an unexpected death, but because it never cheats to kill you, you don't really mind. You give it another go and hope that you do better next time. In that sense, you can understand how it helped to inspire one of the most successful roguelike derivatives of all time. Spelunker embodies the genre in all but randomness.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, that love for the West fades abruptly as Famicom goes all in on that most Japanese of genres, giant robot games.